Hi, Monica.
Hi, Peter.
How are you doing?
How are you doing? Oh, I'm good. How are
I'm
you?
I'm great. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
I guess we wanted to talk about the midterms here. This is the big thing that everybody's talking about. Um, and since we're both sort of policy people, I tend to stay a little, or at least I tend to stay a little further out of the details of all the the individual races. I guess sort of the question is that I think is most interesting is what is this election actually about from a policy perspective? What are voters actually concerned about? There's the obvious argument that a lot of people on the left make that I think has a lot of truth to it, which is that this is just a reaction to the economy, to the terrible unemployment numbers. I'm increasingly seeing stories, though, that are pinning at least some of this or suggesting that there's a strong relationship between healthcare votes for Democrats. There was a story in National Journal
Hmm.
this morning that said, basically all the Democrats, the majority of the Democrats who voted against the health care bill are doing just fine, while the folks who were part of the Stupak bloc, who came in and sort of pushed the bill over the line at the end, are in fact the most endangered Democrats. It's pretty clear that people don't
Hmm.
like the health care bill. I'm sure you can figure out other ways to make those factors correlate, but it does strike me that at least even if I guess I sort of go back and forth on this. On the one hand, um, voters, it's clear that that voters are unhappy with the economy and that they're going to take it out on
Hmm.
whoever is in power. On the other hand, they
Hmm.
probably also have particular policies that they really don't like, and healthcare seems to be at the top of that list. And so, if when they're pulling the lever, I guess people don't pull levers anymore. When they're touching that touch screen, um, with their with their forceful, angry finger. I don't like you, Democrat. It's going to be because they're at least thinking about the healthcare bill while they're doing that. Um, uh, so I don't, I kind of don't know here, and I don't know, I don't know enough.
Hmm.
Like I said, I go back and forth, and I guess I'm sort of curious what
Hmm.
your thoughts on this were. The other suggestion that I thought was kind of interesting. Ross Douthat wrote something basically arguing that it was a reaction to the bailouts and to TARP, which is
Hmm.
especially interesting given that that was something that started under Bush.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I pay attention to policy, obviously, but I also pay attention to individual races. And I'm originally from Arkansas, and so those races interest me a lot. And when I hear people talking about things like the healthcare bill, which they just refer to as Obamacare, and things like TARP and the bailouts, it really is wrapped up. It's not the individual pieces of those policies that people are debating and whether those were good or bad, and they're not having the same kinds of debates that maybe you and I would have about how it was done and other ways to do it, and whether Keynes was right or wrong when he said that government should, flood money into the economy during these kinds of recessions. What they do is wrap up those things into sort of a shorthand to talk about the bad economy. So they know the economy is bad. They know that they have much less purchasing power than they did in the past if they're lucky enough to still have jobs. Those people who still have jobs feel very lucky to have them, even though they don't really make enough to get by and they can't get credit anymore. And the credit card companies are cracking down and raising their fees, and they can't get new cars, even though they always qualified for financing before. So the people I know who care about those things wrap up talk about TARP and Obamacare into that overall broader economic problem that they blame Obama for because he's in office now. So I tend to think that people, when they do, to the extent that average voters do talk about policies, it's not necessarily, in the detailed way that, might suggest that it really is truly TARP and the bailouts that they're mad about. I think they're mad about the economy, and TARP and the bailouts seem to be things related to the bad economy, whether they know how they are or not.
I mean,
So,
I certainly buy part of that argument. The credit card thing. I think to some extent we see. You can trace back credit card. The way credit card fees are going up and bank account fees going up. You can actually trace that back to some of the new regulations. with banks not being able to with banks not being able to charge some of the overdraft fees and that sort of thing, and so
well,
but
that's their
right,
reaction
right.
to the regulations.
But sure, my guess is most people don't make a lot of those distinctions and make those sort of regulation A led to effect B, it's going to lead to effect C, and this is the reason why it was done. On the other hand, it strikes me as at least somewhat worrisome, especially coming from policy people, people who think about policy and whose job it is to explain policy to folks. I think we're both aware that a lot of voters are not super aware, super in touch with the details of policy. On the other hand, I worry that we don't give them enough credit sometimes. When we say, oh, they don't really think about it in a sophisticated way and they're just sort of lashing out. I'm sure that happens sometimes, but I don't know if it's happening with everybody. There are voters who make somewhat more sophisticated calculations than that. While I'm not sure we can trace all of those back, I always get at least a little bit uncomfortable, sort of saying, oh, well, voters just don't really have, don't have a sophisticated understanding enough of policy where they're going to make those kind of smart choices. And so therefore, the two are only sort of related. It's backlash. It's whatever. On the other hand, I think there's some truth to that, but I'm just not quite sure how far that really goes. I guess, part of this, on the other hand, we saw what the ABC News poll the other day, saying that optimism in the country's system of government has gone to its lowest point in something like 35 years or something like that. And so to me, there is sort of, I agree that there is, a larger disaffection that is going on here. And it's just, I frequently find it very difficult to separate out what, whether voters are actually reacting to specific policies, whether they're reacting to overall economic climate, whether they're reacting to sort of particular politicians and scandals, if it's the Aqua Buddha ad or Rand Paul's followers, kicking somebody in the head in the Kentucky election, whatever it is, sort of weird things that pop up and reshape elections rather than policies. And so I guess the thing though is the thing that I would go back and say is that voters may be reacting to the economy, but when they react to the economy, that is in some ways a reaction to policy, to what policies have played out, what their effects have been. And so voters, and so when voters think like that, that doesn't strike me as a totally insane way to think about your vote. And we see, I'm a little, I've been a little fairly critical of the stimulus, at least skeptical. I don't think the reporting on that is terribly reliable, or at least. Maybe that's not what I should say. What I should say is I don't think, that there's a great reason to be very confident that the headline figures on the stimulus reporting are accurate. And I think, when you look at the unpopularity of the stimulus and TARP and that sort of thing, I think voters are reacting to those policies, sort of, and thinking, okay, maybe they don't understand the exact details of the policy, but what they do see is that those policies have failed to produce the results that they were hoping for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, so I don't mean to disparage the sophistication level of the American voter, but I will also say that what we are talking about in this election as far as the American voter goes, it's a very small portion of Americans right now. Most Americans aren't going to go out and vote this November. And so the people more active might be engaged in different ways, but, so I just wanted to say that, but also,
although if
things
you
like the stimulus,
that too is policy related in a way. If you look at where the energy's at, it's on the Republican side, and I think it's pretty clear. I think it's at least reasonable to say that at least some of that, the lack of energy on the left, is a result of the policies that were passed and the policies that weren't passed. And the energy on the right is pretty clearly, I think, partially a result of the policies that were passed. Now, whether it actually reflects a sophisticated understanding of them, that's another question. But it was a reason. But people are reacting to policies that they would have preferred not be passed, or be passed on the left.
I think that's right, but I don't necessarily think that the cause and effect that the American voter sees between policy and the economy isn't necessarily in line. What we know now, I mean, things like the deficit, much of the deficit comes from the economic slowdown that began in Bush's presidency. That is Bush's fault. The crash, well, not entirely Bush's fault, but the fault of deregulation over the past few decades. And so the crash that nearly caused a Great Depression, and I don't think most Americans know how bad it really truly was.
I don't know if I would agree that it comes from deregulation. Now, Bush certainly, I mean, I've written about this a couple of times. Bush certainly deserves a lot of blame for ramping up deficits, especially in the last year of his presidency, although I'm not sure that deregulation was a big part of that. I mean, it was, spending. It was lowering tax rates without cutting spending, and and increasing spending without paying for it. I'm not sure that the regulation side, and then Obama also added to that when he came in. I mean, that was
but I think people misunderstand what Obama had to deal with. And that was a legacy of a deficit at the same time that you had this dramatic economic slowdown. That really, austerity isn't the answer to a country that is very nearly on a deflationary spiral that was going to send us into an awful Great Depression. And so what you can't do is say that in the 2 years Obama's been in office, he's entirely responsible for the fact that we're not in a full recovery. Now, I of course think that the problems with the stimulus was that primarily it wasn't big enough, but more importantly, I think has happened is that.
On that tip, on the argument that it's not, that it wasn't big enough, I don't know if you saw Kevin Drum's post yesterday. It's basically saying,
no.
What he said was that there was nobody at the time who was seriously considering anything larger than a $1.2 trillion stimulus. We ended up getting $780 billion or thereabouts. So it was going to be about 50% bigger. And so if you accept the headline job figures, the job reporting from CEA and from CBO, as that's definitely true, then you get 50%. Then you don't actually get that many more jobs or that much better GDP. You get some more, and perhaps many of those votes would have gone Democratic, but probably not all of them. Maybe a larger percentage than not. But how many votes would those figures have actually even flipped? And how much better would the economy be? In fact, if you look at what Kevin Drum, sort of his back of the envelope math, suggested, if you basically sort of extrapolate from the effects that the stimulus has supposedly had here, back to it, as to what it would have been under a bigger stimulus, the effects are significant in some ways. On the other hand, they don't put us in a spot where everyone would have likely been happy. In fact, most people would have still been very unhappy.
I'm pretty sure it's inevitable. The things that I think are inevitable are that the economy, this recovery was going to be slow, and people weren't going to, and unemployment was going to be high at this point, probably even with a bigger stimulus. That what we had faced was going to inevitably set this up. If it had happened a few years before Obama was elected, then Obama would have been in a better position to kind of catch an economic upswing. But I think it was inevitable that at this point in time, we were probably going to see more Republican voters out this time around and people unhappy with the economy. I think that there's kind of no way to avoid that. I think the stimulus would have been bigger because I think, even those more few jobs would have been better. But really, what I do think you have is a populace that doesn't really understand kind of how slowly unfolding policy changes are. And so one of the things we see with the stimulus too is that some of this money is just now going out still. And, some of the structural changes that were made during the Clinton years to some of the regulation changes made during the Clinton years are just now kind of having these broader term effects that we saw with things that led to the decline of Wall Street. And so I think kind of the timeline along which these things unfold, Americans don't understand. So though it seems as though Obama's presiding over a deficit, the biggest portion of the deficit, as you said, is that we cut taxes in a time of two wars. And what I think Democrats did most poorly was not sell their packages better, to say that these were the antidotes to all those Republican years of mismanagement, and that it was going to take a while for the antidote to take effect, and that it wasn't going to be perfect because things had gotten really bad. I don't think that ever really happened.
So
you're right. Some of the headline numbers are a little, it's hard to trust them, and it's hard to trust them for a good reason. And so I think that's what people are reacting to in some ways as well.
Well,
that those things weren't sold in a realistic or good way.
I guess we maybe want to come back to stimulus skepticism in a little while. But I think I have a hard time maybe sort of reconciling two of the sort of the Democratic narratives here. On the one hand, a lot of Democrats are saying, and like I said, I think there's good evidence for this. This is entirely plausible. In fact, it's probably the best theory about the bulk of how voters are, why voters are turning Republican in this election, and why Republicans are energized, is that the economy is bad, is that voters are simply reacting to the economy. And on the other hand, a lot of Democrats have said the biggest problem is that we failed to message our policies properly and explain them to people and tell people, sort of what we've done to help them. But no messaging. As you say, policies roll out slowly. And so even if all of the changes, all the policies that, if we assume that they're all going to work spectacularly, no amount of messaging was going to change the fact that they haven't worked yet, and that that unemployment is still above 9%. And so messaging, maybe it was the fault of messaging, or maybe it was the fault of the economy. But it strikes me as at least something of a disconnect when folks on the left say, well, we should have just explained this better. But explaining it better wouldn't have changed the fact that the economy is still in the dumps by many standards.
I think that's true. I think what it might have done, though, was kept the base a little more excited. And I think that ties into what you were saying, too, about enthusiasm and the stuff that Obama hasn't done before for people on the left. And that's actually, I think, a big part of the reason that a lot of people who might vote Democratic really aren't going to be bothered to go to the polls, because Obama made a lot of promises to a lot of different groups that are really important to the Democratic coalition. And it's not even that he hasn't done those things, because I think people understand that there's gridlock in Washington. Some bills are really hard to get through. Cap and trade was always going to be hard to get through. But what I think it feels like to really progressive voters is that he's not really a champion who's at least going to say that those things are important to him a lot. He says we're going to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we're going to do it through Congress. But then Congress doesn't do it, and he doesn't say, oh, then this is a thing that I'm going to do myself. That this isn't the ideal outcome, but this is really, really important to me. So I'm going to sign an executive order suspending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I think from that perspective, that's where the messaging really matters the most, where, if you had people who maybe are on the margins who are kind of inclined to vote Democratic or think that Obama's economic policies are better, might feel better about it if what they had were a realistic champion who was actually a champion for those things. And so I think that's where the messaging matters, is that it wouldn't do anything to help the fact that 9% of Americans are unemployed and many more are underemployed, but it would kind of keep the ire from people inclined to like Obama away from Obama, I think, a bit.
I mean,
so that's where I think the messaging matters.
Yeah, that makes some sense. And, on the other hand, you sort of if you go down the route of I mean, in some ways, the way to please more folks on the left would have been to do more and to say include a public option to pass cap and trade, to kill Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that sort of thing. But particularly with the first two policies, when you go down that road, when you pass those policies, you actually lose big constituency. I mean, you further energize the right, and you anger, say, the business lobby, that sort of thing, even more. I mean, that, as far as I can tell, is why is a big part, at least a big part of why we didn't end up with a public option, is because the strategy on the healthcare bill was, let's bring industry to the table, and as far as we can try to make a deal with them, that sort of thing. And so I guess I wonder sort of what the other effects of say going further would have been, and I suspect they would have, at least canceled out, if not actually, perhaps made things worse for Democrats here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I think, and this is kind of, I think, cynical of me, but I'm inclined to think that Americans were going to elect a lot of Republicans this time.
Well, I mean, it's a midterm election after in a first term presidency, they tend to go the other way.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not really sure that there's anything that Democrats could have done, or I'm not sure that there's anything that, and I know there's nothing they can.
Fatalism. This is liberal fatalism.
Well, I mean, a week is a
Republican would never say that. Republicans always think that George Bush could have saved things.
I just want to say that I think that's the biggest difference. I think that's why I think that causes liberals a lot of problems, is that they're always going to say stuff like that, that they're always going to let their cynicism and fatalism come through. But no, I think I think it was always destined to do this. I don't think actually that the Republicans are going to win as big as some of the predictions have, and they also have to win pretty big just to take the majority back in the House. Gaining 40 seats is a pretty big gain. And
well, I mean,
that's about.
I guess I just the polling seems to be pretty clear that the Republicans have a very, very good shot. What Nate Silver has had Republicans in the upper 70s, the chance of Republicans taking the House in, I think, the upper 70s for a couple of weeks now. I do wonder if there isn't too much confidence on the Republican side. Certainly, I heard let's just say an editor from a very conservative publication over the weekend predicting something like, pickup of 10 seats in the Senate and like 60 plus seats in the House, like just, completely straight faced, totally confident, like there's no chance that Democrats, are going to cut into that at all. And that doesn't match with the polling at all. The polling is pretty straightforward. It's a couple of pickups in the Senate, and it's mid 40s, high 40s in the House. The question is whether it will be a wave or not. Whether they will all sort of flip towards the R seats. I don't know if if you want to continue along this, if you want to talk about some of the other things.
We can talk a bit about TARP, because I think that is kind of a nice. It feeds into a lot of
So I mean,
the latest.
It's an issue that people are very frustrated with. There's been some liberal commentary, that on TARP it was a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't policy. If you do it and you don't make money, people are going to hate it. If you do it and you do make money, well, people don't really seem to like that either. Although now we have the Inspector General's report saying, being pretty critical of how Treasury has handled TARP. Inspector General basically said that they haven't been transparent with how they've reported losses on AIG. That from one report to the next, they changed their accounting method without disclosing that there was a change, and basically made a $40 billion loss. I believe that's the figure, $40 billion loss just sort of disappear. And then was even more critical of Treasury's handling of reporting on HAMP, the mortgage modification program. Basically said that, well, Treasury's claiming all 1.2 or 1.3 million modified mortgages as successes, when in fact something like 700,000 of them weren't, defaulted a little later. I look at HAMP and I think, my colleague Tim Cavanaugh has written, basically that HAMP was kind of a half-assed effort to help homeowners, and wasn't in fact really intended to. It was just sort of intended to keep to keep banks going, and that is it. Yeah. In fact, has had that effect. Excuse me. And so So the more interesting thing to me on this, though, is how criticism of TARP has spread across right and left. There was the Firedog Lake picked up a just brutal piece by Bill Black, who has been, who's no libertarian, who has been pretty critical of banks and how banks have behaved throughout the crisis, but basically saying that that taxpayers are ending up on the hook here because a lot of the losses got shuffled off to Fannie and Freddie, which we're now seeing could, bailing them out could cost hundreds of billions of dollars extra, more than what we've already, than the 150 or so we've already spent. And then, and I saw that at just maybe a week ago or so, I think middle of last week. And then just this week, I saw the National Taxpayers Union, a sort of a conservative libertarian organization, basically make the same argument. And so it's interesting to me to see how some of the groups, sort of on the fairly tough free market right, and on the liberal side, are making the same arguments against this policy. And on the other hand, you've got a lot of centrists saying not only was it absolutely crucial to stabilize the banking system, but we're making money on it. This is a huge policy success. So this really seems like you've got the edges versus the center on this.
Well, I agree that it was probably necessary. I don't think there was any way to let the largest banks, some of the largest banks in the world, and the banks that they're connected to and the other firms that they're connected to fail at all without great human cost. I mean, that might have been a fun experiment in what the free market actually does and doesn't do, but I think that the human cost of that would have been horrific. And I know some people are really pushing back against the idea that that it was going to be horrific for every single market. I think Dean Baker wrote a post saying that the arguments about TARP's necessity for saving the commercial paper market, which is something that most people don't know about, but is actually very important to the way that their businesses function, the businesses they work for function. But I think there was a report a few months ago that found that without TARP, unemployment would have been something around 16%. And that's just unemployment. So I think in some ways it was probably necessary policy-wise.
Do you remember where that report came from? I'm just curious. I didn't see that.
No, I definitely heard about it on NPR. I don't remember where that report came from. But I'll find it. But the damned if you do, damned if you don't argument is probably also true. There was just no way to let those institutions fail, and there was no way to make it look good. I mean, Wall Street was always going to come out looking both great and horrible for the country. They were going to come out saved and not do it very gracefully. I think that was always going to be true. And the ways in which people do and don't understand how bad it was I think are also very great, because there's kind of no way to succinctly explain, and also because I don't think a lot of policymakers really kind of knew necessarily what was happening and what was going to happen. It was all very new in some ways too. But I think the thing that I think most makes the left angry is how this was supposed to be the transparency president, and he's done a very poor job of that. You mentioned the report that they shifted their accounting methods conveniently for the AIG losses, and they haven't been very forthright about really where we're making money and where we're losing money and how. And they're not really saving homeowners, which is what the left really cares about. I mean, I think there are a lot of policy arguments to make for keeping people in their homes. That's overall a good thing. So that's not really what was done, though. What was done was that banks didn't have to account for those losses on their balance sheets, when they didn't have to write down home values, and they didn't have to suffer the losses that they should have suffered. That's what happened with the home mortgage program, and that's what's happened so far. So I think, it really isn't a good situation, which is why I think you find this widespread criticism. It wasn't sold very well. The administration's not being very open about it, though they promised transparency in the beginning. The bankers aren't being very gracious about the fact that taxpayers saved their jobs. So I think it's really a perfect storm, and I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that's difficult, right? Because you can never say, you can never convince people that it would have been worse without this horrible thing that we had to do, and that you can't make them feel the savings of that. You can't make them feel not having experienced a bad thing. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in fact, maybe I'll lose my libertarian card for this, but I'm in fact fairly sympathetic, at least to lawmakers who voted for it. The speed at which things were happening when TARP came about, and when the package was first put together, people were very uncertain. It wasn't clear what was going to be a good idea, what was going to work, all of that. Paul Ryan, voted for one of at least one version of it. You have like I said, I'm fairly sympathetic towards legislators who voted for it. On the other hand, it always strikes me that if you're going to go ahead and do something like that, then the crucial thing, and of course it's very difficult for elected officials to do this, but then the crucial thing is then to do an honest accounting of its effects afterwards. We had to do this rapidly. We felt like that was in the 8 days or 10 days or whatever it was, in the very short time we all had to. This was a choice we made. Maybe it wasn't quite the right one, but then, all right, as this rolls out, let's make sure we keep it honest. We keep an eye on it, and so that's what's so frustrating here, is that you've got these conflicting reports. You've got the Inspector General saying that there's still $80 billion left to be dispersed, that there's 170 something, I think, that still hasn't been repaid, alongside with these arguments of, not only we're being repaid, we're making a profit, the whole thing. And so, it strikes me that a lot of the biggest problem with, maybe not the biggest, but one of the big problems with TARP, it's not so much voting for it in the first place. Elected officials were not, experts on the financial system at that point, unfortunately. But for better or for worse, they weren't. And so they did what they could do, what they thought they had to do. They didn't like it, a lot of them. I think it made a lot of them nervous. But then, rather than, but now it very much seems to me that a lot of the folks who supported that policy, who were behind it, who voted for it, who advocated for it, have gone back and tried to make it look like this great success, which it's really not clear that it was nearly as successful. Again, like you say, we can't do a counterfactual. Maybe the banking system would have collapsed, but maybe not. You can go back and you can find regulators who, throughout the last 30, 40 years saying, oh, if we allow this bank to fail, if we allow that bank to fail, if we allow this to happen, it's going to be total chaos. And
Mm-hmm.
then, things failing and it not being total chaos. The banking system has survived failures that were
Mm-hmm.
supposed to bring
Hello?
about. Hello?
Oh, now I've lost you.
Hmm.
Hello? Hello?
That's kind of awesome. Well, that's a strange
Mm-hmm.
sound there. I'm gonna try that one more time.
This is the worst. Okay, good.
That was strange. There was
That was
it's a,
you heard the strange
yeah.
robotic. It sounded like people going.
I thought it was a Muppet villain. Something out of Jim Henson's workshop had taken over my phone. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's try one more time, and then we should probably wrap this up because our communication
Yes,
system
I can't tell how
are
long
not
it's been.
going to cooperate here. I think we've got about 35 minutes of content, but we can probably
Okay.
go on the shorter end because I don't think Sang is going to enjoy putting this together.
Yeah.
Apologies, Sang, if you can hear me. So I mean what I was saying was before we got interrupted there was basically just that there's been a lot of sort of anxious. We're going to vote for it. We're going to say this is a good idea, and then on the other hand, then come back try to justify it after the fact rather than do an honest accounting, and that's why I think the Inspector General has actually been pretty good on this, but the coverage of it, in the media and the way legislators have talked about it, that sort of thing, has it struck me as an effort to paint over a lot of the problems that the policy has actually produced.
I don't think it has in the aggregate. I think if you gather all the newspaper stories together about TARP, it paints a pretty complicated and nuanced picture. I think it's just one of the limitations of newspapers that they're going to grab on whichever the biggest headline is that seems to be right. But, and so on any given day, it might look like it's been skewed. But I think also too, that you're right in that, I mean, kudos to the fact that there is an overseer and an inspector general who's going to have these honest accountings come out to be a check against the kind of spin that the administration would want to put on this out of necessity. But I think going back to what you said about the policymakers not being experts in this situation, I'm actually I'm sympathetic to the votes that they cast because I still think it's right. I mean, you can go back in history and you can find times that banks didn't fail and it was okay. But the broadness of what was happening and the total encompassing of the banking system that was happening into this one big problem, I think was pretty justifyingly horrific to people who were trying to make decisions at that time. And if you look at the ridiculous scramble and freezing that happened after Lehman Brothers, I would rather have had an overabundance of caution that worried about the human effect of what would happen if all those banks failed than I would just trusting that the free market would work these things out. So I think that they made the right decision at that time. You can't risk another Great Depression just because sometimes bank failures have been okay. So I think that was probably, I mean, I think that when you read accounts of what happened at that time, people were justifiably terrified. And but you're right. I mean,
like I said, that's why I'm very sympathetic to legislators who voted for this. Your policy guys come up and say, yeah, there's a 50-50 chance of a Great Depression here. As a legislator, what are you going to do? Probably you're going to spend the next 3 days reading everything you can about this, but even that, what are you going to learn in 3 days or a week or however long it was? That I don't recall the exact, time frame. and how many legislators are going to sort of cast the vote that may or may not, to sort of, all right, let's take that chance. Again, I'm like I said, I'm a little more skeptical that TARP really was necessary. On the other hand, for legislators who are not are not deep experts on the financial system, I have a lot of sympathy for the choice they had to make, for the very difficult choice they had to make at that time.
Mm-hmm. And the choices that they're having to make now that are also difficult, and how to defend it and how not to defend it.
So the other thing we wanted to talk about, was another choice that legislators are going to have to make here. Which is how to get a budget through after the election here. If we presume that Republicans are going to take the House, which I think is the most likely outcome, but not the Senate, and then we still have Obama in the White House, of course. We're set to run into some interesting budgeting problems. The conservative paper editor I mentioned earlier said this weekend, that he was fairly confident that Republicans were going to seek to defund Obamacare, defund the healthcare bill, in whatever way that they could, and said, well, then the question is, whether or not President Obama will sign that. I think it's pretty clear that he won't sign anything that significantly defunds the healthcare bill. And actually, Paul Ryan sort of said the same thing, talking to Phil Klein at the American Spectator about a week ago, I think. But put it in a light. Sort of tried to say these are the limits of the defunding strategy. We can go ahead and we can pass spending levels that are lower than what the president wants, and we can cut funding to certain parts of the healthcare law, so that certain parts of it there won't be any money to implement it. But when you send that to the president, you end up in deadlock, I think was the word he used. And so, I think it's going to be at least interesting politically. There's going to be a showdown here. That if you're headed for a deadlock, and it's largely about the healthcare bill, which is very unpopular, or at least or fairly unpopular, consistently unpopular. If you're headed for deadlock, does that benefit the Republicans who are taking a stand against the healthcare bill? What was it Tom Coburn said yesterday? I think it was Tom Coburn said something to the effect of, well, our plan, since we can't, is just to put up a repeal bill and vote for it as many times as possible, and we're just going to keep voting and keep voting. Really seems to think that doing that is going to be a political winner. I'm not sure that's the case, as much as I have serious problems with the healthcare bill. And so I guess sort of the budget showdown that we're headed for here, you can have Obama back down, you can have Republicans back down, or you can end up in a government shutdown, which a lot of folks have raised the specter of the government shutdowns from the 90s, and I those obviously did not benefit Republicans at the time. There are a bunch of Republicans who've told me that they think it could benefit them this time, and or at least Republican supporters anyway, not legislators, but Republican supporters.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm a little curious sort of where you see that going, how you see the politics of it playing out, because it's a policy battle on one hand. It's also a very political showdown and statement from both sides on the other.
Yeah. I'm a little bit skeptical of their ability to do it, just because of what we were talking about before. I think Republicans are going to take the House, but the amount by which they're going to overtake the House is not going to be a runaway majority. And so they might have some ability to do things there, but then in the Senate, the Democrats are probably going to retain control. And I think when Congress is in gridlock, I think Obama's biggest problem politically has been that he seemed to rely on Congress too much, and people really hate Congress. And I think if you have Congress,
on the other hand, I mean, like, that's been a kind of a political winner in some ways, like to allow Congress to do stuff so Congress can take the blame. I mean, this is part of the strategy. It's not just let's defer to Congress out of because we don't want to mess with them. It's also let's let Congress do stuff so that people will not like them, and then I'll step in at the last moment and and try to fix things.
Well, I think that either way, if Congress grinds to a halt, Obama is going to come out looking like the winner. He has slightly better favorables than Congress as a whole anyway, and he's going to come out as he's going to be the only one who can do anything, and he's going to be able to take stronger stands, I think. But I think a government shutdown is bad. I don't know. I'm curious to know why it is that the Republicans you talk to think it would actually be good this time around.
The basic argument is that the healthcare bill is really unpopular. So anything you do to fight for against it is going to win you points. And that.
Well, I think that's a little bit. Go ahead.
And I mean, like. It's unpopular. It's consistently unpopular, and the energy is on the unpopular side by far. On the other hand, the polls don't show a gigantic split. The split is usually it's around 6 points between favor and don't favor, and so it's not clear to me that when it's relatively close. Again, it's not that it's It's unpopular. It's clearly unpopular and consistently unpopular, but it's not clear to me that fighting against something that does have a sizable number of people who support it, and and if you're doing things like it also opens up Republicans to the fairly easy line that Democrats are already using, which is do you want to repeal guaranteed issue and community rating, the regulations that take care of pre-existing conditions that require insurance companies to cover you. And so as soon as Republicans start doing that, they always tie themselves in knots as soon as that happens. And they say, well, we want to do that, but we don't want to do it. And the only person who's taken a clear stand on this that I can recall in the past couple of months, the only elected official type, although he's not anymore, is Mike Huckabee. Oddly enough, came out against requiring insurance companies, just clearly against requiring insurance companies to cover pre-existing conditions. But in general, legislators are really bad at or at least Republican legislators are really bad at figuring out what they want on that. Understandably. It's not an easy issue to talk about.
Yeah, and and that's what I was going to say.
They're not good at it. They always allow that argument to tie them in knots.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because you kept saying the healthcare bill was unpopular. But, if you call it Obamacare, people think that they don't like it. But if you talk about the individual portions of it, then when you drill down, you see that the reasons people don't like it vary. And the things that they don't like about it vary. Nobody likes the individual mandate because it's something called the individual mandate that makes it sound like they're going to have to buy insurance.
Well,
even though that's not true for the majority of Americans because they already have insurance. So... so there are aspects of it people dislike, and they dislike it for good reasons. Nobody wants to, the idea that, forcing people to buy insurance without a lot of income support for doing so and without affordable insurance is something that sounds awful. And so, I think, and then you have a lot of liberals who don't like it because there wasn't a public option. You have a lot of liberals who don't like it because it forces people to buy insurance from private companies who now have a ton of new customers without a whole lot of stuff that they have to do for them. So I think that, when you start to talk about repealing it, you're always going to run into those troubles you talked about. There are portions of it people like. There are portions of it people think are necessary. And there are portions of it that people think are good moral things to do, like making sure people don't die from curable diseases in one of the richest countries in the world. even if they don't like the policy that got us to doing that. So I think that that's going to be a losing issue for the Republicans. I mean, if you repeal the individual mandate, you're going to lose the insurance companies who are behind it because of the individual mandate, who have a justifiable argument in that they won't be able to have stuff like guarantee issue without a bigger pool of customers on which to draw. So, I mean, I don't think that that's going to be a winning issue for the Republicans. And I also think the extent to which people are angry about the healthcare bill will wane as some of the benefits start.
I mean,
going
over
up.
the last
And
6
as
weeks or so, it's actually ticked up just slightly. I mean, it doesn't show any sign of waning. I guess maybe, who knows how over the long term, it's impossible to predict. But at least in the sort of the near term here, it's not clear to me that there's like the supporters of the bill have been saying since before it passed that, as soon as it passes, it's going to be, people are going to take to it. And then as soon as it passed, well, just give it a little bit of time, wait till the insurance protections, the consumer protections kick in September, wait till we explain the benefits a little bit more. It'll get popular then. Well, in September, it became less popular. Over the summer, one time, in fact, that it ticked up in popularity was in the middle of the summer when the issue was basically not being talked about. And that, as far as if you actually go back and you look through the fall, and the early parts of this year before it passed, it was those periods in which other events dominated the news that it would tick up in popularity by a couple of points. I don't, is it because it's not being talked about? Is that what makes it popular? I don't know, but it's not at all clear to me that any messaging effort, the left has spent tens of millions of dollars on messaging. They're putting tens of millions of dollars more into this, and nothing has worked so far. It has held pretty steady at being more unpopular than it is popular, and at being and with the energy strongly on the unpopular side. I think.
Well, I mean, and I think I never heard anyone talking about it in a way that it would be unpopular as soon as it passed. I mean that it would be immediately popular as soon as it passed. One of the reasons I think progressives were mad about it is that there was not going to be any relief for people who have insurance now through their jobs, but for whom it's still really expensive and for whom those policies aren't very good, and so, the vast majority of Americans who already have insurance through their employers aren't going to feel the effects of this without something that will help drive those premiums down long term. So the healthcare bill, we're not going to feel the effects of until like 2015 or 2016, and maybe not even then. So the very few people that it's helping now, the really, really, really sick people who have to be able to have insurance now, are the only people that it helps. And that's a good moral argument for the bill, but it's not something that is going to make it popular for people.
I guess I'm not entirely convinced that most people who get their insurance through employers won't have their coverage. Won't feel its effects. I mean, it's possible. It's not a certainty, but it's possible that many employers will end up dropping coverage. And letting people buy insurance through the exchanges. It's where you already see changes in health spending accounts that are required. So people are already not being able to purchase not being able to do their health spending
over the counter.
Their health spending account purchases the same way. So they've already felt changes in there. Those are small changes, but people tend to feel. Even small changes pretty strongly, and if there's a politician attached to them, they end up lashing out, and they don't like a lot of that stuff, and just don't like it being forced on them by the government anyway. That's the general. It's a policy change. They'll grumble about it if HR does it, but if it's sort of a system wide, if it's a political change, that generally tends to cause people to react even more strongly. And if you do end up, where was it? I'm blanking, but there was I was reading from one of the healthcare some healthcare report, looking at how employers are going to react. It was within the last couple of days, and somebody, one of the folks, sort of doing analysis in the report was basically like, well, right now it's a toss up whether employers are going to, really drop a lot of people off of their coverage and put them on the exchanges or not. It could go either way, which I think is right. I think, I don't think we can say, oh, it's definitely the case that employers are all, we're just going to see tens of millions of employees lose their insurance and get dropped onto the exchanges, but it's entirely possible, and certainly several million will. I mean, that's what CBO predicts, is you're going to have millions of people. Now, if it's only just a couple of million, that's a relatively small percentage of the overall workforce who's getting their insurance from their employer, but that's going to be covered to death. That's and it's still millions of people who will all have family members and friends and that sort of thing, who they'll tell about it. They're going to Many of them will not like it. Probably some of them will. Oh, I get better insurance through the exchange, subsidies, something like that. But many of them will not like it. Will not like the forced change being required to, and they will understand that this is a result of government policy, not allowing me to keep the thing that I had. And when you understand that 85% of people who have employer insurance are pretty happy with it, even if they don't like the healthcare system overall, even if they want change, et cetera, and you see that millions of them, according to CBO, are going to be dropped. It does strike me.
Well, you have to
compare.
I mean, this is another situation that is somewhat like TARP, too, though. It's very, very, very likely that those millions of people would have been dropped from the health insurance rolls by their employers anyway. That was happening. That's been the trend line forever. That was going to continue to happen. Insurance premiums were going to get more and more expensive. Fewer and fewer employers were going to be able to keep their employees on plans. Certainly those plans were going to drop in quality, as they have been doing, and families were going to have to pay a lot more towards their premiums and in deductibles and in co-pays and co-insurance. So the millions of people were going to lose their employer-provided insurance in the next decade anyway. And so it's another one of those things where it's like, it's hard. Now they have an option when that happens. Now they have insurance exchanges where they have to be issued a plan. Hopefully there will be some price controls on those plans. They will get income support if they're very low income. And so it's one of those things where you have to convince people that it would have been worse without this. That this isn't entirely the fault of the government in this situation. And so I think Americans love to hate things that the government does for them, but insurance is just one of those things that government does better. And that's not a theory. That's something that we see play out in the entire world. Countries that cover their entire populace with health insurance do so by having some sort of government involvement in the system.
I mean, was it Shel Silverstein? It could be worse. I mean, this is, as a political message, whether or not it's true, it doesn't strike me as one that's going to be easy to get across or likely to convince a lot of the population to vote in your direction. I think legislators are going to have a tough time with that. But I mean, and especially when you see that insurance premiums are going to continue to go up anyway, and that either some portion, whether it's a very small portion or a somewhat larger portion of that, is due to the regulations. I mean, even HHS is saying, that some percentage of the increase is in fact a result of new regulations. And so when people hear that, my guess is that a lot of them are not gonna, like I said, are not going to respond well. But I guess this is all sort of how healthcare plays out in the long run will be the topic for will be a topic to discuss for a long time. I guess the more immediate thing that interests me just is the budget part of this. I guess we're both not convinced that Republicans are going to do well to really take a stand on defunding the law. On the other hand, I think Republicans feel like they have something of a mandate to do whatever they can to attack the new healthcare law to stop it, bring it down, or cut it back. And that is certainly the most plausible, the most likely to be effective route of attack. As you know, with Obama in office, they're not going to. There's not going to be any option to repeal until there's a Republican in the White House, which is not something that we're going to have for the next couple of years. And so it almost strikes me that Republicans have worked themselves into a tough spot by charging people up against the healthcare law and saying, we're really going to do something about this. We're going to do something about it. We're going to fix it. And what can they actually do? Well, they can do a bunch of stuff that at least it's not clear to me whether or not people will like it.
Yeah. Well, on that note, a lot of things are unclear right now.
We should have some clarity in a week or so.
I think so. Maybe we'll talk again then.
Nice talking to you, and
good talking to you.
Yes, thanks so much. Glad we finally got to do it.
Yep, thanks a lot.
Bye, Michael.
All right, take care. Bye.